Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Robert Epler. I'm a political science student from Derby, Kansas, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs such as this one and networking with our special guests. Through the Institute, I've had the honor of meeting the former Madam President of Kosovo and the pleasure of learning from KU's brightest students. I'm proud to be a member of the Dole Student Advisory Board, and thank you all for building community here. If you're a student and would like to join, please email dolesab@ku.edu or speak with one of our student workers after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel, Dole Institute of Politics. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of these devices. If you have any questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert our staff members. After the program, we'll have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come over to you. Please stand if you're able and ask just one brief question. If you're a part of the virtual audience, you may submit your questions at dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please keep your questions in mind with this. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones now. Please join me in welcoming our two guests from the Bipartisan Policy Institute, Michael Thorning and J.D. Rackey.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today. I'm Michael Thorning from the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I wanted to start out by thanking the Dole Institute. Our organizations are pretty well linked by former Senator Dole, who was a founder of BPC, and obviously who is the namesake of this institute. So it's really great to be here today. And Senator Dole spent so much of his career in the Congress representing Kansas, and I think it's appropriate that we be here to talk about how to make Congress work better. Senator Dole really was a strong institutionalist who believed in a Congress that functioned, that represented people, and that got things done. And so we're here today to talk a little bit about that. My colleague JD is going to come up in a little bit, but first, just to sort of lay the groundwork, maybe show of hands in the audience, how many people here approve of the way Congress has done its job in the last 2 years? Okay, maybe I did get a little better response. How many people disapprove of the way Congress has done its job over the last 2 years? Okay, for everyone at home who can't see the audience, it's basically a unanimous disapproval. And that's basically where the public is. We're pretty low for our last 50 or so years of congressional approval, but as you can see, Congress has never been a particularly popular institution in our democracy. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Congress is somewhere that people go to hash out deals. It's often ugly. It's competitive, and people tend to feel very strongly and warmly toward their own representatives, but not particularly positive on the institution as a whole. And that makes sense. People send representatives to Washington to present their interests to the nation, and those ultimately and inevitably clash with the interests of our diverse and vast nation, and what comes out of Congress often ends up being something of a grand bargain, a deal, a compromise, finding common ground where we can. So often I think people look at what Congress does and they say, well, that's not what I wanted Congress to do, but very often it's the best Congress can do given who we send there. Just to give you some comparisons of things that are more popular than Congress, according to polling. This polling's about 10 years old, so I only fear that the situation has gotten worse for Congress, not better. In the spirit of the Halloween season here, witches and zombies ahead of Congress, jury duty, the DMV, traffic jams, root canals. It's an unfortunate thing, but I think the reality is that I think people feel pretty glib and cynical about Congress, and I think this demonstrates that. And for good reason, right? Congress, often on display to the public, looks pretty dysfunctional. We've had a series of government shutdowns in recent years, and Congress has not been a very productive institution, I think, by a variety of measures. But the American people generally feel like Congress isn't getting a lot done for them. They're not getting to a lot of agreements. This is just something that kind of gets worse and worse. We have not just trouble agreeing on policy, but then the public sees internal political conflict between even members of their own party in Congress. And then, you have a pretty hard time. The leadership there is often sort of on a knife's edge. Republicans have essentially either formally or informally ousted two of their last four speakers. Speaker Pelosi, although she sort of navigated a difficult political situation after the 2018 election, ultimately, her party, I think, did decide it was time for her to move on as leader. She read the tea leaves on that and decided to leave before potentially being pushed out. But what this ends up with is there's just not a lot of agreement on major issues that the public generally wants something done about, whether that be on health care, whether it be on things like climate change, whether it's on immigration. Leading issues of the day really are having a hard time getting through Congress. And again, you have sort of internal conflict, sometimes recently physical conflict, it seems like, on display on the floor, but also just within factions of parties, there's a lot of infighting. And a consequence of that we at the Bipartisan Policy Center are very concerned about is that when Congress is not able to do its job, very often you have an executive branch, the president, who's all too willing to step in and in our view, often step across a line and engage in what really could be arguably legislating, which is supposed to be Congress's job in our Constitution. The president tries to fill that gap. And so this has been going on for decades. The presidency, the executive branch is sort of ascendant. And as we've just been discussing, it feels like Congress is kind of descendant, and it's not the center of our government and policy making as the framers of the Constitution imagined it would be. And so you have all kinds of examples here, just three from the current administration, where the president seems particularly fine just openly defying whoever is in office and whoever is in the majority in Congress, perfectly comfortable defying Congress. But obviously the previous administration was no stranger to this dynamic, and certainly examples from the three before that. And really, we have to ask ourselves, what do we do about it? But it's not just the presidency. So recently this year, the Supreme Court had a really impactful ruling that's going to have a lot of consequences for Congress. This has to do with how executive branch agencies make rules, regulations that affect all of us, whether it be things about food and drug safety, whether it be about how our healthcare system works, whether it's about energy. Our executive branch agencies make a fair amount of policy. And the Supreme Court recently overturned one of their precedents that essentially is going to make it so that Congress has to write much more of these laws. So we're actually in a situation where Congress is having a really difficult time passing laws and getting to agreement. And the Supreme Court is saying, well, actually right now Congress needs to step up and figure out how to do more than it's doing. or else the government's not going to be able to carry out what it wants to. And so Congress has begun a little bit to reckon with this, but we're really only just kind of getting started there. And so, for decades, political observers, political scientists, have recognized these trends. In the 90s, Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein wrote in the early 2000s, The Broken Branch, followed not many years later by It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and then just a couple years after that, It's Even Worse Than It Was, which I think describes a lot of political observers' view on what's been happening in Congress. So what do we do about it? How do we fix it? It's pretty complex. We have political considerations, small d, sort of democratic constitutional considerations. How do we want Congress to look and operate? And then internal institutional considerations. What kind of rules does Congress have, and how does that work? How do relationships get developed in Congress? How do we encourage members to work together? It's a pretty overwhelming question when you think about it. I mean, it's an institution of 535 independent actors who represent each hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, and shaping the institution to function better is a little bit like herding cats. And so, different political observers, experts have proposed some different ways to solve this problem. Some people, think we've got a problem with our electoral system, that our primaries don't work well. I think the argument essentially is that it either sends the wrong person to Washington or it creates the wrong incentives in Washington for getting things done. Some think that it really just incentivizes a lot of bad partisanship, negative partisanship, that the parties really just get caught up in trying to win the majority and sort of defeat or persevere over the other party, and you wind up not getting much done. Other people point to the influence of money in politics. Congress isn't working because the wrong interests are represented. Members are more aligned, according to these arguments, with the interests of their campaign donors or influential, wealthy members of society than everyday Americans, whoever they may be. And then, you have some observers, former U.S. Senator Jeff Bingaman, who was my boss, first boss in the Senate, but many former members, current members of Congress often write about what the internal problems are. Senator Bingaman here really pointed to, I think in his view, we really had a crisis of leadership and character, that members of Congress, weren't willing enough to take tough votes, that they weren't willing to do things that didn't poll well or that might not be popular when they go to get reelected, and that has had a lot of bad consequences for the institution. I think we at BPC, we've wrestled with all of these things, and we've worked on some of them. We've worked on primary reform and campaign finance and trying to change some of the incentives in Congress. But a particular problem that none of these diagnoses seem to address, and which JD will get into here more in depth, has to do with whether or not Congress actually is set up internally with the resources, the staff, the technology, the space, the models, the decision-making ideas and systems to do its job. What we and others generally refer to as congressional capacity. And so JD is going to come up and talk a little bit about how this problem sort of came about in Congress and what we can do about it and what has been done about it.
Thank you, Michael. That's a perfect lead-in. Good morning. Excited to be here with you all. So as Michael was saying, there's a multitude of problems that plague Congress and congressional operations, and the incentives that kind of inform how members behave, and from polarization to money in politics and things like that. But what we've been focusing on intensely the past couple of years with our colleagues at other institutions and within Congress itself is that of congressional capacity. This great book by a conglomeration of scholars talks about capacity being kind of the organizational resources, knowledge, expertise, time, space, and technology that are necessary for Congress to perform its constitutional role. And what they detail in kind of systematically in this book are things that people who work in Congress or who have served in Congress or even close observers of it have noticed for kind of the past 30 years, that there has been a decline in congressional capacity, meaning that staff turnover has increased. On average, congressional staff serve only about 3 years in Congress, 3 to 5 years, which, for people who have ever had a job, it takes at least 2 years to get good at your job. And then, so we have a situation where congressional staff are getting good at their jobs and then leaving, either to private industry or to the executive branch or to lobbying. And so that kind of decreases Congress's institutional knowledge. There are other capacity issues such as outdated technology. Until very recently, Congress didn't have a Congress-wide calendaring portal to know when all of the meetings are across the body. They still do not have, though it is in the works, a staff directory for the entire legislative branch, so they can't even call each other to collaborate on issues. There's a wide range of basic workplace things that every other industry has, every other government entity has, that Congress has kind of denied itself for a variety of reasons for several decades, which has kind of put it in a position that it is not able to achieve the desired outcomes of either what the Constitution intended Congress to be doing or what the public really expects of Congress. And so I know Michael and I have been very doom and gloom this morning about all the problems Congress faces. But the good news is that they have, over the past 5 or 6 years, been trying to do something about it. To their credit, members and staff had realized in 2018, 2019, like maybe not everything is going as it should. Maybe things are not working. So they stood up this temporary committee in 2019 called the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which its main goal was to push Congress into the 21st century, kind of reverse trends in congressional capacity, atrophying, and kind of figure out what Congress needs to lead us into the future and reassert itself as the first branch of government. And it is so the committee was formed in 2019. I worked on the committee in 2021 and 2022, trying to put solutions together that were actionable and would have immediate impacts on the running of Congress. At times, it felt like trying to put out a fire with a garden hose. And here you have on the right Representative Kilmer, who was the chair of the committee for 4 years. And on the left is former Representative Tom Graves, the Republican from Georgia, who was the co-chair for the first 2 years of the committee's operations. The committee ran for 4 years. We had 49 hearings and business meetings across those 4 years and came up with 202 recommendations for fixing Congress. And I was talking with students here last night. I think we passed 202 recommendations. I think we generated well over 500 things that could have been done. And I think the members of the committee would say, this is what we were able to get bipartisan agreement on. Even if we implement all 202 of these recommendations, we know there's a lot more work to be done in fixing Congress. But we agreed to 202 recommendations in a wide variety of areas, whether it's facilitating more bipartisanship and civility and collaboration. So recommendations in that space included encouraging committees to have bipartisan agenda setting retreats at the start of a Congress so they could agree like what issues they were going to tackle that Congress, to creating staff collaboration spaces where staff could get out of their personal offices and interact with staff from other offices, in particular staff from the other party, to think about ideas and learn how to work. Changes to workforce recruitment and retention and professional development opportunities. We passed several recommendations about allowing staff to be reimbursed for tuition expenses or to get professional certifications to help their career advancement while staying on the Hill, keeping that institutional knowledge within Congress. Changes to member orientation have been implemented. It used to be when new members of Congress were elected, they'd show up in Washington, D.C. for orientation, and they would be put on a Democratic bus and on a Republican bus, and they would be sent into opposite directions, and it would take months for them to meet members of the other party. There was very little bipartisan orientation. Through our recommendations and work of the House Administration Committee, they've kind of started to reverse that a little bit, and now there are several nonpartisan orientation exercises at the beginning of every Congress so that members of Congress can learn what the job of a member of Congress is, how the institution works, how HR in the institution works, how proposing legislation works in a nonpartisan way. And there's also some networking events that associate that so that new members can meet members of the other party. So as you can see, it was a long laundry list of recommendations that at times were difficult to get consensus on. But we had what we called kind of our secret sauce of operating that made, in some scholars' estimations, this modernization committee the most successful in history. Congress has been doing reform and modernization committees about every 30 or 40 years. And most of those committees' work turn into reports, which this was the report. And then they sit on the shelf and do nothing with them. So we took a different approach, kind of learning from past failure, and to kind of lead to what we considered has been a success. The first is that the committee was designed to be bipartisan from the get-go. So there were equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats who were serving on the committee, 6 of each. And for any of the 202 recommendations to pass, we required that 2/3 of the members support it. So they were bipartisan in nature. In reality, all of the recommendations, or most of the recommendations, passed unanimously or with 90% support. But we were also bipartisan in practice. We kind of had this motto that there are no red jerseys, no blue jerseys, only fix Congress jerseys. And we actually had baseball jerseys made that said fix Congress that hung in the office. It was a good reminder of what we were there to do. And so the committee started both Congresses with a bipartisan agenda setting retreat. We also had one staff and one budget. So normal committees in Congress, they have the Republican staff and the Democratic staff, and they work for their party members and kind of push their party agendas. We didn't do that, so we had one staff, so I worked for all 12 members of Congress on the committee, and giving expertise to them, giving advice, and our whole staff did that, and it kind of helped make sure we were all on the same page and help build some consensus. We also had bipartisan seating in committee meetings, both in hearings and internal meetings. We didn't sit with Republicans on one side of the room and Democrats on the other, but rather alternated bi-party at the table. And that came from our chairman, Mr. Kilmer's recommendation that He said, you know, when you're in a meeting, you're naturally inclined when you hear something interesting to lean over and talk to the person next to you. And he said, you know, wouldn't it be great if the person you're leaning over to talk to is a person from the other party, so you can kind of start engaging right away. Our hearings were also in a roundtable format. So normally if you were to turn on C-SPAN, you would see a dais with members up high and the witnesses down low, kind of often being scolded. We kind of ditched that format and sat around either a square table or a round table with all the members and witnesses on the same level, kind of engaging in lengthier discussion, so extended back and forth. We got rid of the 5-minute rule that says every member gets 5-minute question period, because that kind of incentivizes members to give a long statement that may or may not end in a question mark, and so that they can use it for press purposes. We got rid of that and just kind of had, you know, normal everyday conversations that kind of mutual exchange of back and forth between members with each other, members with witnesses, that really allowed us to dive down deep into issues. And then we also introduced and passed recommendations on a rolling basis. Rather than waiting for the end of the 2-year period to write the full final report and say, okay, you know, pass things all at once. That has historically led to a decline or an inability to come to a consensus if you're trying to agree on everything all at once, all 200 recommendations all at once. So instead, kind of we had tranches of hearings. We'd have 3 or 4 hearings, then we'd come up with the recommendations and pass them in smaller blocks, kind of as consensus emerged on those issues, which helped us prioritize implementation while the committee was still operational. So we started working to implement the solutions we were coming up with rather than, while we were still coming up with new solutions rather than waiting for everything to end. And then one of the biggest ways that we were successful was that we really had this mentality of a community of modernizers. Historically, reform committees would have all of their members on it. They would talk to maybe some other members on the committee and off the committee, but it was usually a chairman and leadership-driven process that said, okay, these are the things we want to accomplish with this committee. We're going to ram through our proposals. We didn't do that. We engaged stakeholders from across the institution, from the nonpartisan support offices that advise members of Congress to the kind of internal, the chief administrative office and the clerk's office that are responsible for doing like the really in the background IT infrastructure of Congress and staff support of Congress, as well as outside stakeholders such as the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Congressional Management Foundation and other groups that care a lot about the institution of Congress and its functioning. By scoping recommendations as we developed them so that they would be implementable, we were really able to kind of work in an efficient manner. And to some great success, I think. So in 2022, the committee ended, and at the beginning of this Congress, it was reformed as a subcommittee on House Administration Committee. House Administration is the committee that is responsible for all the internal operations of Congress and also congressional elections, but I won't talk about that. And so the subcommittee, when it was formed, was tasked with implementing all of these recommendations from the Select Committee. And at BPC, we maintain a tracker of how they're doing. And so far, 71 have been fully implemented, 80 are in progress, and 51 are still open. And so with over 3/4 either implemented or in progress, that's a record high for Congress and congressional reform entities. And through some research that we did at BPC in conjunction with research by the Congressional Management Foundation, who surveyed a bunch of congressional staff. They have found that operations have been improving. These recommendations, as they're implemented, are making a meaningful difference in staff lives, in the ability of constituents to get around the Hill. For example, they just constructed ADA-compliant ramps all over the Capitol campus, which surprisingly they didn't have before now. And members have started to see some impact of the recommendations as they're implemented. That being said, the recommendations that have been implemented have mostly been in the vein of the operational capacity things and less so in the building bipartisanship and civility. In part because those recommendations are a little bit more crunchy and harder to get at because it requires members and staff kind of not just policy changes, but them altering their behavior and their attitudes, which is kind of a culture change that needs to take place. Beyond implementation, the new subcommittee has continued to explore new areas ripe for modernization. So they've been leading efforts on figuring out how artificial intelligence is going to impact congressional operations, and through some of our colleagues' research at the Pop-Fox Foundation, they found that Congress is actually the leading legislature in the world when it comes to figuring out what to do about AI, which is not often that you can say Congress is the leading legislature, and so that's great. There's ongoing work to figure out continuity of government, so what happens to government and Congress in particular if there were mass incapacitation of members of Congress or and the like. They've started modernizing the Congressional Research Service, which is the kind of internal, nonpartisan brain of Congress that advises members on policy issues. That was formed originally in the 40s, transformed in the 70s, and really hadn't changed all that much since then. So they've been updating kind of the products and services that the Research Service provides to Congress to kind of meet modern needs of the institution. And as well as they've expanded the role of the Government Accountability Office to have access to better data, and they stood up a new organization within the GAO aimed at kind of assessing new technology as it comes online and how that will impact certain policies. So overall, Congress has been trying to take a stab at its capacity issues. I think it's been very successful, but that does not mean we did not have challenges and that challenges are not ongoing. And kind of the two biggest challenges we face in trying to grow and a congressional capacity is that, one, no one has ever lost an election by running against Congress. Congress is, as Michael laid out, an easy target to paint as the boogeyman. And so that then makes it hard to justify spending taxpayer dollars on boosting congressional capacity when there's a narrative out there that Congress is bad or useless or ineffectual. And so that's one kind of shift we have to overcome. The other is that institutional incentives are often overridden by partisan incentives. So it used to be, and the founders intended, that the Congress would check the executive branch, right? And they would kind of ambition counteracting ambition. But with the rise of parties, when your party controls a chamber of Congress and the White House, that kind of creates a different incentive for action to move your partisan agenda rather than think about your role as Congress versus the president. And so these two things are the arguments we face as we continue to try to improve the institution, grow capacity, and also tackle some of those other non-capacity issues that are plaguing Congress. But I think I will leave it there, and we can open up to some questions that Michael and I can hopefully answer.
What are the three biggest changes that have been put in effect right now that from the committee work you've done?
Yeah, so I think by and far the largest change that was put in place while the committee was still operating was bringing back of congressionally directed spending, otherwise known as earmarks. And this is where individual members of Congress can assess the needs of their district and kind of try to get projects put through the appropriations process to fund things for their district. There had been a 10-year moratorium on that, and the committee made the recommendation to bring it back. I don't know if you have other, I think that's by far the most important for kind of local representation and kind of connecting members to constituents. Did you have another?
Yeah, I would say the work that's been done around what we call the congressional workforce has been both hugely impactful, and there's more to be done there. It takes time to develop a highly skilled workforce, but they took some big steps. JD talked about that they tried to create some professional benefits to incentivize professional development, getting higher education degree, whether that's a master's or something like that. There's new internal training programs that didn't exist before. Like in a lot of legislatures, people show up to work there, and even for our political science, either alums or students, right? You don't sit around in class and talk about how do I negotiate, how do I draft a bill, how do I really do the day-to-day operations of working in the legislature. And so there's a lot more training around that now. And then a major thing that they did was change some of the incentives around pay. Congressional staff, unbeknownst to the public, are probably some of the worst paid people in Washington. They make less than people in the executive branch. They make less than just about everybody in Washington in the private sector. And that, again, has been kind of caused by some of this sort of self-flagellation that Congress has gone through in recent decades. It's really hard politically to justify that, and no one wants to have to go up for re-election and explain to their constituents why, for instance, they're paying their staff much more money than people might be making here in Lawrence to live in Washington, which is a much more expensive city. The politics there are really tough. I think Congress took some steps there, both in giving members a higher budget. It's still up to them to make the choice of how they want to pay their staff, but giving them more resources to hire more skilled staff, but also eliminating some other barriers that existed sort of within congressional rules and policy. That ultimately what we want is we should want Congress to have the best workforce that it can, right? I mean, they're working for all of us, for the taxpayers, and so I think that has had a big impact, and it's one that we're going to see play out over time, because ultimately the goal is we want people to work in Congress longer, right? 3 years, on average is basically nothing, and so I think if you invite me back here in 3 or 4 years, I'm hopeful that I'll have even more to say about the good that's come from that change.
I'll add that beyond any specific recommendation, I think the biggest impact of the committee was the changes that we modeled in how to run a hearing, sitting around in a circle, not by party, kind of diving into issues in a more in-depth manner. The Chairman Kilmer always says that if you want Congress to behave differently, then you have to do things differently. And so by modeling this alternative hearing format, it kind of gave others in Congress we don't have to always run hearings the way we've been running them. And we've actually seen examples of other committees kind of having bipartisan agenda setting retreats and having more free-flowing hearing operations. And so it's slowly kind of building a culture around that. By and large, members are not happy with how Congress is being run, and that's a left and right bipartisan agreement on that. They just didn't have examples of how to change it, and I think the committee's example gave a model of how, one way that they could do things differently.
I'll give you a bonus. The new member orientation training to make, or process to make it more bipartisan and just generally less partisan, we have already heard from members that they're just really pleased with that. That their experience is a lot better, and so I think that again is something that makes a difference. You want to start off on the right foot when you get there when you're new, and so that was a big change. That was a long time problem. That was an easy fix once you really get down to what the problem is.
I have another question.
Could you go back to your last slide, please? In light of the fact that immigration reform seems to be one of the major issues in the presidential campaign, and given the fact that one of the most conservative Republicans in the Senate chaired a committee that met for weeks and weeks, a bipartisan committee, wrote a bill that there was no one that I ever heard that thought would not be passed. And in a 2-hour period in an afternoon, the former president of the United States kills the bill with a series of phone calls to Republicans. With an institution, despite these changes that you make, how do you explain an event like this, which really, when you look at it in light of the importance of immigration reform and how it's become a major issue in the campaign, how do you, if you have, and I'm not pointing fingers necessarily at one person. There are others, I presume, in both parties that could certainly act in the same way if they would wish.
That's a totally fair question. I'm going to go back a few slides here and just to say, and including, sorry, one more, this as well, right? These are long-term trends that we're talking about and very complex around polarization, internal dynamics, and I think what you just brought up this example around immigration and how do you have this negotiated bipartisan immigration deal that seems to get right up to the finish line and then can't get done for what seemed like, I think to almost all observers, very nakedly partisan reasons. Congressional capacity, improving that is not going to be able to solve all of these things. We can't fix the electoral system through it. We can't really change the influence of money in politics or this sort of party teamsmanship, right? It's more important for our party to beat the other party than to get things done. It's going to be hard for congressional capacity to overcome that. Well, we still need congressional capacity, right, to be able, right, so that bill didn't just get written out of thin air, right? They relied on experts within Congress, experts outside of Congress as well. It took skilled staff just to get to that point that, yes, it didn't get done, but all the work that goes into getting there, that all, comes from this. And so we fully admit there are other problems in our political system and that impact Congress that this work is not going to overcome. We think there's going to need to be other fixes that do that, but separate from those, it's also important that Congress just be able to function and carry out its basic duties, let alone trying to tackle really big policy problems.
I'll rephrase that another way, is that even if you fix all of those other problems with elections or the partisan incentives, that without capacity, Congress still won't be able to do the things that it's supposed to do.
There were people who are responsible that said that's an example of why the whole system of Congress is broken, which much of this is not going to fix. I don't know what you do. You go to Nebraska, I have no idea. But if that can happen, it makes you wonder about how can you ever fix the system.
Yeah, while we go to someone else, I'll say The Congress is endlessly complex. I often quip that I picked up from a professor along the way. It's the second most studied institution in the world after the Roman Catholic Church. So yeah, there are not easy solutions, and different incentives and different operations all intermingle, and it's a big web to kind of parse through. And so there are no, I think our main point is always, there are no silver bullets to fixing Congress. It's going to take lots and lots of changes from lots of different directions to kind of move in the right direction.
Limits enter into any of these conversations? Because I personally feel like you said about 2 years to learn your job. You know, you can't, because people, yeah. So
JD might be able to speak a little bit to what they discussed at the committee. I will say from kind of outside stakeholders, people who study Congress and are trying to get Congress to improve itself, there's a big divide, I think, among what the general public sees as a need for term limits and what people who study, have worked in, and observe Congress see. And I think where that divide largely comes down is that the latter group sees that there's actually a really bad side effect of term limits that people don't think about, which is that when you have very inexperienced legislators by design, someone who's maybe served 3 or 4 terms in Congress, which is 6 to 8 years, it's very easy for them to be co-opted by some of the other groups that we see here, right? If you're an inexperienced legislator, it's a lot easier for your own party leadership to sort of take advantage of you and roll your vote on an issue the way they want it to go. Potentially a lot easier. I think the argument is that people who have the influence of money, whether it's corporations or other stakeholders, wealthy individuals, again, inexperienced legislators, and I think as a part of that, also legislative staff, if they're inexperienced, you're not going to be able to do your job well if it's really easy for people to take advantage of that. And so I think that speaks to the benefit of experience. I think an interesting proposal that a member made to the committee, I don't know if the committee ever actually discussed it, but was actually to not term limits, but to change the terms for members of Congress from 2 to 4 years.
3 years.
Oh, sorry, it was 2 to 3 years. And in that way, kind of trying to create more room for them to learn their job and do their job, and not be going from this sort of like, you get elected, you've got about 9, 10, 11 months to do something, and then you're running for re-election again because of the way our political system works. And so that kind of goes a little bit, some thinking in the other direction, but JD can probably talk to what they discussed as a committee.
Yeah, so term limits, campaign finance reform, other bigger political reform issues certainly were in the ether in our operations, but as I said in kind of how we worked, we by design had to have 2/3 support for any recommendation that was passed. And at the outset of the committee, they held a bipartisan member retreat to kind of figure out what things they wanted the committee to tackle. And so kind of these bigger issues were discussed at that retreat, but there wasn't bipartisan buy-in to really dive into term limits or into campaign finance reform. And so we stuck to the capacity issues because there was bipartisan agreement there. Though certainly many members think that those other issues were worth discussing and maybe worth discussing in the future. And so, yeah, that's what the committee considered. I'll close that by saying James Madison wanted 3-year terms for members of Congress. He was overruled by the Constitutional Convention, but that's how we ended up with 2. But
I'd also add that to the committee's credit, they were very pragmatic, and one of these bullets here about prioritizing implementation. I think there's something, whether we're talking about campaign finance or we're talking about term limits, some of these other bigger changes that people imagine, those, it seems like, are all going to require constitutional amendments. And Congress can do something about that, but it can't fully address that itself, right? Ultimately, that's a question they have to put out, a constitutional amendment, to the rest of the country. And so I think they understood the enormity of the challenge of having to do that, and decided to prioritize things that really were within their control to fix.
On using artificial intelligence to redraw congressional districts? And if so, do you think that would lead to less extreme left and right candidates getting into Congress?
I have not seen that yet. I think it's a fascinating idea. I'm endlessly fascinated by the different methodologies and things that people have come up with to try to draw fairer congressional districts and to take out some of the the incentive for party bias and for parties to draw the lines to their own benefit. I haven't seen anything about AI. I think it's an interesting idea that I'm sure someone is thinking about. There are a lot of proposals already about using relatively sophisticated, whether it's mathematics, geometry, all sorts of different, applied sciences to try to draw lines in a more neutral way and in a fairer way. And I think we should continue to explore those. One of the challenges that runs into is just sort of the politics. And it's not one party. It's usually by whatever party controls the state that they're in. It's in their interest not to change it. We've got a lot of heavily gerrymandered Democratic states, and we've got a lot of heavily gerrymandered Democratic states by a lot of measures. And so, there's a challenge there. The other thing too is that there might be some limit to how much of our current problem can be solved by fixing gerrymandering, because we know people have different theories about how and why, but people are very efficiently, I think is what political scientists would say, efficiently sorted geographically. Democrats and Republicans tend to live in communities that look like them. We don't know if that's because people move there because they want to live in a community that looks like them. I think there's some evidence that people move to a community and then they adopt the views and culture of that community over time. But what we know is people are really heavily clustered. And the more clustered people are by party, the harder it is to draw fair lines that account for that. And so, you do look at some states and it's really hard to see how you draw a district in an area that, either party could win or that, doesn't favor the party that the rest of the state is dominated by. And so, I think there's something inherently, right about, trying to address the sort of cheating aspect or the perception. But I think there's some limit to how much we'll get out of it, unfortunately.
You seem to talk about the work of the committee in past tense, and so 2 years have passed.
Yep.
And so are there going to be new recommendations? You're constantly coming up with new goals and whatever, because a lot of things have happened in the last 2 years.
Yes.
Yeah. So we talk about the committee in the past tense because that's where the bulk of the recommendations came from, and they set the model off. But as I talked about, the current subcommittee on modernization has kind of two goals. One is implementing all of those recommendations, and two, continuing to explore new areas for further improvement. And so they've been really heavily diving into AI and how AIs could create efficiencies in congressional operations, as well as kind of updating Congress's support entities so that they can get more efficient information processing, more reliable data to kind of help them work in the modern world. And we on the outside also continue to bring new ideas to Congress. So one, there was recommendations on it. They haven't been implemented yet, but we just released a series of recommendations on how to make better use of member time. As they fly back and forth from DC to their district quite a lot. And there's a lot of inefficiencies in that calendar. There are also, when they're in Washington, a lot of scheduling conflicts, multiple hearings happening at the same time. So members kind of sit down, do their 5-minute spiel, and then have to run to another hearing. And there are very simple algorithms and introductions of block scheduling and things like that that could create more time for members to spend in committee or in their district or in DC to really more substantively dive into issues and be a little bit less performative, we think. So the work does continue. It's just moved into new forms as the select committee ended, the subcommittee got stood up, and so we're kind of constantly evolving with the dynamics around these issues.
And we're hopeful, you know, the creation of this subcommittee, what that really signifies, this is sort of really DC insider stuff, but you know, the previous format was a select committee, which by nature is sort of seen as like a temporary thing. Eventually this is going to go away. This subcommittee, you know, is a more permanent, you know, fixture, you know, and so our hope is that this really signifies that Congress recognizes that, you know, that this is an ongoing improvement, right? That this work doesn't end, that they need to be sort of constantly paying attention to it. Right now they're in a situation where they really need to work on it. Hopefully in 10 years, you know, the work is lighter because it won't be as pressing, or they won't be in as bad of a situation because they'll have done what they should. But, you know, there's a term, you know, in business terminology, very common, you know, continuous improvement. You know, you get better and then you get better on top of getting better. You know, we're hopeful that the subcommittee, because of its permanent nature, will allow them to think about these issues in that kind of way.
So new people coming in, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel.
Also that, yeah, we don't want new people feeling like they have to come in and reinvent the wheel. And so that really speaks also to the, you know, this creates some long-term institutional knowledge about this work because it's a more permanent thing. There was also a recommendation from the original select committee that a new select committee effort should be stood up about, I think, every 4 Congresses or so about every 8 years, that they should do the more full, expansive view, whereas this, you know, subcommittee work is going on in between.
Yeah, and the reason for that recommendation is while the subcommittee is more permanent, it is more implementation focused, and it is only House admin committee members who serve on this subcommittee. The select committee had membership from a couple different committees. It had freshman members of Congress on it. So it tried to get at all the different views that of congressional operations and into the idea generating process, so we thought every 4 Congresses you kind of need a more expansive effort of engaging stakeholders from across the institution to hear their ideas rather than just at the subcommittee level, which could potentially be insular over time.
I appreciate the focus on operational improvement, things that are actually achievable. But do you have anybody inside the organization that's looking at structural reforms, long-term things that are needed? I think it was the book Tyranny of the Minority. They list some structural reforms that are needed, and they look at Norway and other countries that are models. Do you have people working internally to look at these long-term improvements?
Yeah, we do that at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and our team does that on top of this work, kind of on congressional operational improvement, capacity building. You know, where that work is at right now, maybe won't surprise you. It's a very different stage in that there isn't even a lot of bipartisan agreement on wanting to address those issues, and that's a really an initial step. You know, I think there's plenty of research out there that, you know, you mentioned Tyranny of the Minority. You know, there's probably hundreds of books, right, about all the different things we could do to change our system of government and our constitutional system. I think where the actual problem-solving stage is you've got to build agreement across party lines right now that we should address that, and I don't think that exists. We're hopeful to change that. It's a hard thing to, you know, really bring to the fore, and for 2 reasons. One, they're all very politically fraught questions, but at the same time, a lot of policymakers are hesitant to address them when they also see that, you know, the public may want them to be focused on what the public sees as other more pressing policy problems, the economy, immigration, jobs, healthcare. And so you're in this, between a rock and a hard place of like, we need to fix the system to address these, other ongoing policy problems, but people want us to address the policy problems more than they want us to fix the structural ones. And so creating the space for members in addition to the buy-in is what where I think that work is right now.
I'll also add that, when it comes to structural reform, and there's a lot of great research out there on it, and I'm actually reading Tyranny of the Minority right now. I haven't got to their recommendations yet. But there is a fear of the unknown when you're proposing changes to any system. So part of why we only passed 200 recommendations, even though we heard a lot more, was as we kind of dug into the weeds of how they would be implemented, sometimes we didn't know what would happen on the other side of implementation. And for bigger questions, bigger structural questions, that's even more true. Not knowing, okay, we think if we alter primary elections this way, that it'll cause this behavior. And there's some evidence in some systems that works, but there's also some evidence that it doesn't. And so the research, while helpful, is not always 100% true to what could happen, and has a status quo bias amongst elected officials. They know the system we have, and they know how to work it to achieve the policy goals they want and to represent their constituents how they think they want. And so it's an uphill battle to kind of push and change that status quo.
It's also the system they got elected under, right? And so for them, they think it works for them.
Yeah.
What I don't understand is, given the sophisticated and the significant needs of this country, and given the disastrous history of legislation passed by Congress in the last 2 or 3 years, and look on how almost nothing has happened this year. And if you look at the important efforts that are made, they've been by executive action. You don't have to be blind to know where that could lead. You end up with a Congress that's gone and an executive that runs on somewhat the European model, if not a worse. But there doesn't seem to be such a recognition yet, is that right, in Congress, about how serious this problem is?
Yeah, I think unfortunately members only realize it's a problem when the other party is in the White House. We saw a lot of efforts, some that we worked on that we thought were really bipartisan efforts, for instance, during the Trump administration to change some of the executive powers around national emergencies, around spending, to bring it more in line with respecting Congress's constitutional authorities. Probably won't surprise you, but Democrats were very gung-ho about that during the Trump administration. And when Joe Biden got to office, basically none of them really were interested in talking about it anymore. And so you have this merry-go-round effect of just, who is interested in it changes. And so we're hopeful that this work is a stepping stone to getting to that. And the committee did have some hearings on Congress's constitutional authorities, and our work it's also where we see that going next is trying to build that understanding, a cultural understanding in Congress that their role is continually diminishing, but a lot of it is they're trading it for what they see as partisan party gains, right? Of we can get, as long as we win the White House, we can get what we want, and I think that's unfortunate. I don't think that's good for our democracy, but certainly, for citizens, you've got a lot more say over who your representatives are and who your senators are than, your vote for president. And so I think people should want their local elected leaders to make a lot more decisions than they're making now. Even the sometimes within the same party, I think about early on in the Biden administration when they were discussing student loan forgiveness, Speaker Pelosi, said, oh, the president doesn't have the authority to do that. Congress has to do it. And that was sort of the administration's view for a while until they decided, no, we are going to do it. And Speaker Pelosi didn't have many objections after that, unfortunately. All right, well, thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.